Hi there, Year 11. It is Mrs Tarbutton with your resource lesson for today. I know that your own English teachers would love to be with you, but they're currently teaching other classes. So for the next few weeks, you are going to have me for your resource lesson. And today we are going to start the process of going through the paper that you did for your mock exam, the English Language Paper 1 on Mr. Fisher. So I'm going to read it to you now. There is a link for you to either see it on your own screen or it will pop up on my screen in just a moment. And of course, if you've got a printer at home, then you can use the link to print it out as well. But it's not necessary to have it printed out because you can see it on screen and then write your answers on paper or your annotations on paper. All right, let's begin. I'm just going to change the view of my camera so that you can see the paper. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to read you the story so that you remember it, and then we're going to have a little look at question 1 and question 2. So source A is taken from the beginning of a short story written by Joanne Harris. Mr. Fisher, a teacher of English for 40 years, works at St. Oswald's Grammar School for Boys. Mr. Fisher lived alone in a small terraced house in the centre of town. He did not own a car and therefore preferred to do as much as he could of his weekend marking in the form room after school. Even so, there were usually 2 or 3 stacks of books and papers to take home on the bus. It had been a disappointing term at St. Oswald's. For most of the boys in 3F, creative writing was on a par with country dancing and food technology. Oh, he tried to engage their interest, but books just didn't seem to kindle the same enthusiasm as they had in the old days. Mr. Fisher remembered a time, surely not so long ago, when books were golden, when imagination soared, when the world was filled with stories which ran like gazelles and pounced like tigers and exploded like rockets, illuminating minds and hearts. He had seen it happen. He had seen whole classes swept away in the fever. In those days, there were heroes, there were dragons and dinosaurs, there were space adventurers and soldiers of fortune and giant apes. In those days, thought Mr. Fisher, we dreamed in colour, though films were in black and white, and good always triumphed in the end. Now everything was in black and white, and though Mr. Fisher continued to teach with as much devotion to duty as he had 40 years before, he was secretly aware that his voice had begun to lack conviction. To these boys, these sullen boys with their gelled hair and perfect teeth, everything was boring. Shakespeare was boring. Dickens was boring. There didn't seem to be a single story left in the world that they hadn't heard before. And over the years, though he had tried to stop it, a terrible disillusionment had crept over Mr. Fisher, who had once dreamed so fierce. Sorry, guys, that just made me, it keeps wobbling and it made me lose my space. I'm going to start that bit again. And over the years, though he had tried to stop it, a terrible disillusionment had crept over Mr. Fisher, who had once dreamed so fiercely of writing stories of his own. They had come to the end of the seam, he understood. There were no more stories to be written. The magic had run out. This was an uncharacteristically gloomy train of thought, and Mr. Fisher pushed it away. Not all his boys lacked imagination. Alistair Tibbet, for instance, even though he had obviously done part of his homework on the bus. An amiable boy, this Tibbet, not a brilliant scholar by any means, but there was a spark in him which deserved attention. Mr. Fisher took a deep breath and looked down at Tibbet's exercise book, trying not to think of the snow outside and the 5 o'clock bus he was now almost certain to miss. 4 books to go, he told himself, and then home, dinner, bed. The comforting small routine of a winter weekend. But gradually, sitting there in the warm classroom with the smell of chalk and floor polish in his nostrils, Mr. Fisher began to experience a very strange sensation. It began as a tightening in his diaphragm, as if a long, unused muscle had been brought into action. His breathing quickened, stopped, and quickened again. He began to sweat, and when he reached the end of the story, Mr. Fisher put down his pen and went back to the beginning, rereading every word very slowly and with meticulous care. This must be what a prospector feels when, discouraged and bankrupt and ready to go home, he takes off his boot and shakes out a nugget of gold the size of his fist. He read it again, critically this time, marking off the paragraphs with notes in red. A hope, which at first Mr. Fisher had hardly dared to formulate, swelled in him and grew strong. He found himself beginning to smile. If anyone had asked him what Tibbott's story was about, Mr. Fisher might have been hard put to reply. There were themes he recognised, elements of a plot which were vaguely familiar, an adventure, a quest, a child, a man, but to explain Tibbott's story in these terms was as meaningless as trying to describe a loved one's face in terms of nose, eyes, mouth. This was something new, something entirely original. All right, guys, so hopefully you remember that from your mock exam, and we're just going to look at question 1 and question 2 now. So here's question 1. Now, my advice to you when you're answering question 1 is that you take your highlighter pen and that you highlight the necessary bits of the question. So let's have a look here. Read again the first part of the source from lines 1 to 4. So I need to make sure that I'm looking only at lines 1 to 4. And it asks me to find 4 things about Mr. Fisher. Okay, so let's have a little look then at lines 1 to 4. So it tells me here that Mr. Fisher lived alone. So there's my first one. In a small terraced house. There's my second one. He lives in a small terraced house in the centre of town. There's my third one. He lives in the centre of town. Oh, and look, there's my fourth one. He did not own a car. So I've got my 4 things already. Mr. Fisher lived alone. Mr. Fisher lived in a small terraced house. Mr. Fisher lived in the centre of town. And Mr. Fisher did not own a car. But let's see if there are any more. And therefore preferred to do as much as he could of his weekend marking in the form room. Mr. Fisher did his marking in the form room. After school, Mr. Fisher did his marking after school. Even so, there were usually 2 or 3 stacks of books and papers to take home on the bus. Mr. Fisher travelled on the bus. So there's a whole variety of possible things that I could write down about Mr. Fisher. But as long as I've got 4 different things from the first 4 lines of the story, then I know I'm going to get my 4 full marks. Okay, let's have a little look then at question 2. So, question 2 always gives you again the section of the text that you need to look at. So you will need your highlighter pen. And again, we're going to highlight the key aspects of the question that you have been asked. Okay, so with your highlighter pens ready, let's highlight the key parts of the question. How does the writer use language to convey Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories of the past? Now I need to look at words and phrases. I need to look at language techniques. And you know what? I don't actually need to look at sentence forms. So I'm going to cross that out. Now, this is worth 8 marks. So I really need to be saying 4 things, and I really need to have 4 decent explanations. So let's have a little look then at the section that it wants us to look at. Now, remember, we're looking for Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories. So here we go. Mr. Fisher remembered a time, surely not so long ago, when books were golden. Ah, now that tells us what he thinks about books, doesn't it? Now, this here, books were golden. This is an adjective to describe the books, the noun books. But were books literally golden? No, they weren't, were they? So he's using here, or the writer is using here, a metaphor. And what does that tell us about Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories of the past? Well, to me, it tells us that he thinks they were precious and that he thinks they were valuable. So there's the first thing that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about golden. Okay, so here's our little plan. Now let's carry on. When imaginations soared. Oh, there's another language technique. So Mr. Fisher believes that books and stories of the past caused imaginations to soar. Now, once again, we've got a word there that is a verb. We've got this word soared. But did imaginations really fly around in the sky? No, they didn't. So that's another metaphor. But what does this verb and metaphor tell us about Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories of the past? Well, actually, if you're soaring around in the sky, that's quite exciting, isn't it? And it also gives a sense of freedom. So there's my next thing that I'm going to write about. I'm going to write about this word soared. Okay. When the world was filled with stories which ran, oh, look at this, guys, like gazelles and pounced like tigers and exploded like rockets. Now, what we got there, when we see the word like, we automatically know that it's a simile. But we haven't just got the word like once, have we? We've got it 3 times. So we could say it's the rule of 3, or we could say it's repetition. So you see, we're noting here the language techniques. But what does this simile rule of 3 repetition tell us about Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories? Well, we've got this image of the gazelles and tigers. They're like wild animals. And then we've got rockets that go into other worlds. So it actually tells us that he thought that books and stories of the past were exciting, wild, and out of this world. So there is my next thing that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the similes. All right, we're nearly there. We're just looking for one more thing. So he had seen it happen. He had seen whole classes swept away in the fever. Now, had he really seen a whole class swept away? Probably not. So we can talk about that as being imagery, or we can say that it is a metaphor. Now, what does it tell us, though, about Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories of the past? Well, if a book or a story can sweep away a whole class, it tells us that they must be powerful. Okay, so there is my 4th thing that I am going to write about. Are there any more things in there that I could write about? There are actually. He says in those days there were heroes, there were dragons and dinosaurs. So we've got a list. We could have written about, I'll jot them down here so you can see the list. And the list has got a variety of things, hasn't it? It talks about heroes and dragons and dinosaurs. So it tells us that Mr. Fisher thought that books and stories of the past had amazing characters. We've got another one here, space adventurers and soldiers of fortune and giant apes. So there's our list and the variety of characters, which tells us that Mr. Fisher thought that books and stories were creative and full of variety. And in those days, thought Mr. Fisher, we dreamed in colour. So there's another one that we could have written down. Again, we've got this idea of dreams, okay? And he thinks that books and stories of the past enabled children to be creative and quite interesting. So films are in black and white and good always triumphed in the end. So when you're going through a question 2, you guys, you need to make sure that you annotate this little section in a similar way to how I've just done here, because now I know what 4 things I'm going to write about. I've highlighted my quotations, I've written down the actual techniques, and I've said what it is that it tells us about Mr. Fisher's views on books and stories of the past. So in doing that, I've set myself up to win, and I've set myself up hopefully to get my 8 marks. Now let's look very quickly at some examples from the mark scheme that I want to show you. Now, a level 1 answer. A level 1 answer is going to be simple, and it's going to have limited comment, and you'll get 1 to 2 marks for something like this. Mr. Fisher likes the books of the past because he uses the word golden. The writer says the story pounced like tigers, so they must have made the reader jump. Now they've identified one thing, but they've put the quotation in and they've explained it, so they get 1 to 2 marks. Let's look at a level 2 answer then. See here, a level 2 answer is going to show some understanding and comment. So the writer uses the adjective golden to describe books of the past, which makes it sound as if Mr. Fisher thinks they were bright and enjoyable. There's one example and one explanation, and now we're going to get another example and another explanation. The stories ran like gazelles and pounced like tigers, so they were really fast and some parts jumped out at you. So this candidate has identified 2 different things, they've given 2 explanations, and they get a level 2 with 3 to 4 marks. Let's look now quickly at how to get slightly higher. So we're going to focus on a level 3. Here we go. Level 3 is clear and relevant explanation, which gives us 5 to 6 marks. The writer uses the adjective golden to suggest Mr. Fisher has a positive, glowing view of the books of the past. He says they were full of stories which ran like gazelles and pounced like tigers. This metaphor conveys that the stories carried you along and were like fast-moving animals, attacking the reader's imagination to make them gripped in what they were reading. The writer then uses the image illuminating minds and hearts, implying that Mr. Fisher thinks that in the past, these stories lit up every part of the reader with enthusiasm. Now you can see here that in this answer, the candidate has identified 3 things. They've identified the adjective golden, they've identified here like gazelles and like tigers, but they have called it a metaphor and not a simile. So whilst that is incorrect, it doesn't really matter because their explanation is clear and relevant. And then the third thing that they've identified is this imagery here, illuminating minds and hearts. And then they give a clear and relevant explanation. So identifying 3 things with 3 clear and relevant explanations gives the candidate a level 3, 5 to 6 marks. Now for full marks, let's have a little look at what happens here. Level 4, perceptive detailed analysis. The writer uses the adjective golden to suggest Mr. Fisher has a nostalgic and romanticised view of books of the past. He thinks the world was full of stories which ran like gazelles and pounced like tigers, metaphorically conveying that not only were there many fast-paced stories, but also that they ambushed the imagination so that the reader was totally immersed in the words on the page. The writer personifies the stories as illuminating minds and hearts to imply that Mr. Fisher believes every part of the reader was affected. Not only did the stories reach the reader mentally, but they captivated them emotionally as if under a spell. Now you'll notice once again that this candidate has only identified 3 things: the adjective golden, the running like gazelles, and then the illuminating minds and hearts. But it's in the top category because the analysis is detailed and perceptive. All right, so you should remember that paper and those questions from your December mock exam. But what I would like you to do now is this. You've also got the links to another exam paper. And the exam paper that you're going to be looking at is a story about a young lady named Rosabelle. I am going to produce a video of me reading that story in a different video that your teacher will post on this link. So you can listen to me reading that story if you need to. If you don't need to listen to me reading it, you can look at the extract yourself, and then you are going to have a go at answering these questions. So once again, question 1, from lines 1 to 5, list 4 things about Rosabelle. Okay, so that's the first thing you're going to do. And then the second question, which is also on the link, you are going to have a little look at this. How does the writer use language in this little extract to describe Rosabelle's bus journey home? You could include words and phrases and language techniques, but remember to cross out sentence forms. You don't need to do that. So you're going to read the extract on Rosabelle, or you're going to listen to me reading it, and you are going to answer question 1. Then you're going to come to question 2 and annotate it in just the same way that we did in the example here. If you don't have this printed out, then you can just make notes on a separate piece of paper. And remember to list the 4 things that you're going to say to help you write your 4 paragraphs. Once you have answered question 1 and question 2 on the Rosabelle paper, you need to upload that to your Google Classroom or onto Show My Homework for your own teacher, who will mark your work and get back to you once they've marked it. Please do remember, you guys, that we do have an awful lot of work to be doing at the moment in terms of marking students' work from across the whole school. So it might take your teacher a little while to give you feedback. So sit tight and don't worry, just make sure that you crack on with the work. Okay, so I'm going to leave you there. You've got question 1 and question 2 to do on the Rosabelle paper. If you need to listen to me reading it to you, then select the next video and you will be able to hear me reading that source to you. All right, take care, guys. Bye.